moment this morning. The issue is kind of really settles down to, if you don't know how to do it, is it possible for it to be done? A lot of people will kind of laugh or take very lightly the idea of Noah's Ark. And the response is that a boat that big cannot be manufactured out of wood. Can't make it out of wood. It's too big. It's 450 feet long, Noah's Ark. Something like 75 feet wide. I've got the dimensions somewhere. I probably didn't underline them. And a little over 50 feet tall. But just because we don't know how today to make a boat as big as Noah's Ark out of wood, does that mean that it can't be done? Do you know how to take rusty ground and turn it into steel? And probably you don't. But that doesn't mean that it can't be done. Now, talking about boats, now we have Bob back here was on an aircraft carrier. Aircraft carriers have a deck that's pretty good size. It's 90 feet from the water line to the deck. Pretty big boat. Well, you know what? The Greeks manufactured some pretty large boats. A Greek historian named Athenaeus gives us an account here of a very large warship built by a man named Ptolemy in Greece in 244 BC. Now, the dimensions of this warship are amazing. It was 420 feet long. It was 57 feet wide. And it was 72 feet tall. Almost as tall as an American aircraft carrier. It had 40 tiers of oars. That's 40 rows of oars. Think about that. The ship was manned by 400 sailors to handle the rigging and 4,000 rowers. 2,000 oarsmen on each side of the ship. It had also 2,850 men in arms for a total of 7,250 human beings on board this wooden warship, recorded by Athenaeus as a warship of Greece. And the enemies of Greece certainly found out about this warship, made out of wood. I had a chance to tour the Eisenhower when I was at Puget Sound. And the Eisenhower has a crew of about 5,000 people. It's a huge ship. And the Eisenhower is a little bigger than Bob's ship. Bob was on the Lady, I think you said, right? USS Lady. Here's a boat that carried 50% more people than the Eisenhower. But think about that. 40 rows of oars. Oarsmen, and it saw battle. This is a historical ship. Is it possible to make a wooden ship as large as Noah's Ark? Sure, this was 420 feet long. Noah's Ark was 450 feet long. This one is about the same size as Noah's Ark, built by the Greeks 200 years before Christ. What's the real issue? As we've been learning from Dr. Ken Hoven's tapes, the real issue is an enmity towards anything that's spiritual, right? Anybody that even has a hint of a philosophy of creation in their hearts is an enemy of the world today. And so the issue is, well, obviously Noah's Ark has to be wrong because, just one excuse after another, because, well, they couldn't make wooden boats that big. Oh, yeah? The Greeks did. Over 2,000 years ago, the Greeks built wooden boats that big, and they used them in warfare. Now, Noah's Ark did not have to be propelled. I'm going to suggest to you that it's much easier to build Noah's Ark than for the Greeks to build a warship with 40 tiers of oarsmen. Because they had to propel, they had a battering ram. I didn't get into that, but it had a huge battering ram, and it was used very successfully. The Greeks are awesome people. Very, very incredible, technically advanced people. So is it possible to build a boat as big as Noah's Ark out of wood? Yes, it is. If somebody tells you that it's impossible, remind them the Greeks did it 200 years before Christ. And nobody challenges that the Greeks did it. But they challenge that Noah could have. The reason being, wood boats can't be made that big. Yes, they can. Once again, I hope you can see what's going on here. People are chipping away or trying to at anything that sounds scriptural. Anything that builds up the Bible or anything that supports a Bible story or a Bible point is being chipped away at by society. The truth is, the Greeks were able to build boats just as big as Noah's Ark, and they built wooden boats that were able to be steered and used in battle. Once again, history proves the Bible is right. Thank you. A number of things in the world that testifies so dramatically to the creation of a marvelous designer, our Lord Jesus Christ. Many people don't know that. Jesus Christ is identified in the Bible as the creator. Long before he was born in his physical body of Mary, he was the creator of all that there is. Well, what exactly is a fungus? If you see something that looks like a fungus, is it a fungus? Well, here's a picture here of a cute little thing. It looks like a fungus. It stands about a ½ inch tall. It's probably hard to see, but it's got a little blob on the top. What it is a bunch of amoebas working together. Absolutely, totally incredible. This is a problem from an evolutionary viewpoint. The problem is this, and here's what happens. It says within about 500,000 amoeba, within a couple hours, will clump together to form a multi-celled animal. Now, if you know, anybody here know what an amoeba is? Have you ever seen one? Most people know. And if you take biology in high school, did you see an amoeba? You look at a microscope slide, and this amoeba is kind of an amorphous mass that kind of squishes and moves around. One of the very first things that you see when you study the life sciences, right? Well, they're a single-celled critter, and it's difficult to place them when they do things like this. Where do they belong in the stratus, in the kingdom, in the naming system? Well, here's what they do. 500,000 or so within a couple hours will stick together to form a lump that looks like a slug. And there's another very small picture here of a slug. It's about a ½ inch long, and it's wiggling along. And what it is nothing but a bunch of amoeba. They don't have a structure. They don't have a brain cell. They're just single-celled critters. They're just plain amoebas. In fact, the name for this particular amoeba is, I'm going to struggle with this, Dictyostelium. Dictyostelium, I guess, is the name of it. Anyway, and then when it slugs itself somewhere, because it doesn't want to live where it was living anymore, because it's too harsh to live there, when it finally slugs somewhere, and you've seen the slug move, I assume, inches along, leaves a slime trail, this thing does, it stands up. The amoeba now start to flow in on themselves until it forms this little peg thing, and up top a very incredible thing happens. An amoeba is not a spore. A spore is associated with a fungus. Well, the top amoeba start to generate cellulose, encapsulate themselves individually in cellulose, and then encapsulate the whole thing in cellulose so that it forms a spore sac. The spore sac will eventually rupture, floats along, and these little individual amoeba are now a spore. And in the article it says, more than likely you have breathed a few in your lifetime. They just float along and you breathe them, and then they settle someplace where it's much more pleasant to live. Now, in fact, this is written up in Scientific American, not just Creation Magazine, if you want to read it in the non-Creation magazine. Well, here's the problem. Here's the problem. Evolution is built up on the idea that absolutely everything came from something else. That you started with, Freddie's not up here anymore. I had to move Freddie because I noticed the kids were running around with Freddie. Or as Muriel says, I should say, Frida the frog. If you remember, the basic presumption of evolution is this, that once upon a time, nothing condensed itself into an energy egg. Now, I'm not making this up. Read it. Read about the Big Bang. As a physicist, I played with that a lot. Read about it. Once upon a time, nothing condensed itself into an energy egg, exploded, and formed rocks. And once upon a time, the rock, in the presence of the right kind of environment, became Frida the frog. And then Frida the frog eventually became a princess. That's That's the presupposition of evolution. Now, for that to happen, and it all happened with no guiding intelligence, right? For that to happen, everything that exists has to be built on something else. The whole classification system, right, is built on the idea that as you build this ladder, as you go from kingdom to phylum to genera to species, it all builds one on the other, and one comes from the other. Well, what kingdom do you put these guys in? It turns out evolutionists have a problem with this. Experts have, and I'll give you a quote here, people within and outside of our field do not know where to put this amoeba. There are 5 major kingdoms. It doesn't fit any of them, right? Plant, animal, bacteria, protist, like the single-cell protozoa, and what's the 5th one? Fungus. Well, it doesn't fit any of them. It looks like a fungus, but it's not. It looks like a protist, but it acts like a fungus. It doesn't fit. They can't classify it. Big problem. Because it doesn't set well. It's not a rung in the ladder that leads up to you. I didn't realize, I studied for 2 years. I studied microbiology. I wanted to be a doctor until I discovered I fainted when I see blood, so that's not good for a doctor. And I never realized as I was going through biology and microbiology and zoology that this classification system, I didn't think too much of it. What they're really trying to do is build up to a human. It's the evolutionary tree. Now, a creationist has no problem with this because we know God created this guy, this amoeba, to do exactly what it does. It has no brain. It can't figure out, whoops, drying up here, gotta get together my buddies and form a fungus. I mean, it doesn't have a brain. It's a single-celled critter, right? Doesn't that point to the marvelous design of an incredibly intelligent designer? So for a creationist, where to put this isn't a problem. We more focus on what does it do. A creation scientist, I believe, is a true scientist because you're concerned with what it does, how it relates with what's around it, instead of trying to force fit it into a ladder that doesn't exist. Besides that, just look in the mirror and you know that you didn't evolve. You're a system designed beautifully and perfectly and magnificently to perform a function. Engineers and scientists define design as a machine that's designed as one that performs a function over and over, logically and well. So do you. That's what you do. You're not an accident. There are accidents that happen. One of our brothers here works in an insurance company, and I just faced an accident with New England Telephone. Accidents destroy things. They ripped the wire off the side of my house, the New England Tel people, and putting up a new phone pole. Accidents destroy things. They don't build things. So these amoeba, what are they? Who cares? What kingdom do they go in? Who cares? Doesn't matter. Create a new kingdom. Doesn't matter. What do? That's fascinating. And that's what a scientist does. Science, by definition, is observation, repeatability, and description. That's what it is. Anything else is philosophy. Spent most of my working career in science. Not as a philosopher. Now I'm a theologian. A scientific theologian. You have a marvelous creator. The Lord you serve is a great God. And don't you ever forget that. Thank you. I was going to say, actually, when he's backwards, people spot him. Anyway, we're all familiar with the sketches and paintings that we see in National Geographic and also the Time Life series. This isn't National Geographic right here, but here's a picture. It's a reconstruction of Paranthropus and Australopithecus, 2 different critters. You look at things like this and you say, well, that must be what they look like. Is it? What do they find when they find a fossil? Do they find hair, skin, and flesh? No. They find bones. Do they find all the bones? No. They don't find all the bones. What these pictures are, and this just happens to be out of a Time Life series entitled as Early Man. These are an artist's rendition, an artist's thought as to what they probably look like after he speaks to the archaeologists and anthropologists who have a preconceived notion as to what early man looked like. I can't find my magazine now. I had a picture, and I don't know what happened to it. I had a picture of the old Nebraska man, the Scopes trial. They just made a television program, right, on the Scopes trial, the Winds of Change or something like that. I forget the name of it, but it was on the Scopes trial. And on the Scopes trial, the scientific evidence that the scientists used to prove that evolution is real was a man called Nebraska Man. And as I've shared with you before, and I had a picture from the London Times that showed an artist's rendition of Nebraska Man that looked brutish and you know, the guy looked like he just stepped out of an NFL uniform, right? I mean, and it turns out that he was built up on a tooth. And it turns out 4 years later they discovered it was the tooth of a pig, not a man at all. Well, National Geographic themselves are being a little more honest. And this is kind of interesting. They had 4 different artists work up a sketch of a critter that's called Homo habilis, and each of the 4 artists, as it turns out, developed 4 extremely different looking creatures, and it bothered them. It bothered them at National Geographic. It's upsetting. If you're an evolutionist, you ought to be able to develop, based on the bones alone, one specific look, right, for early man. Well, as it turns out, they had 4 artists, and they were unable, those 4 artists, to agree. They came up with 4 totally separate pictures. There's a picture of a man here named Ron Irvin. Well, Ron Irvin actually did some work for National Geographic, and he was told to draw Lucy. So he did some work, and he drew what he saw as Lucy. He was told to change it. He was doing this for an evolution textbook, actually, and he was told to redraw it to make it look more ape-like, so that when it shows up in the biology textbooks and anthropology, it'll look more like an ape and less like a person. They don't know. How accurate is National Geographic? Not even one tiny iota accurate. There were no cameras back then, and what they find are little pieces of bones. They don't find ever the whole structure. When they do find all of the bones, it's not from the same spot. It's from all over the place. It can be a mile away. Did you realize that? One of them, I can't remember which one, I think it was Lucy. And they found the head, then they found an arm a mile away. And they put it all together because it belongs. I'm not sure which one, but that was. They don't ever find them all in one spot. And then they reconstruct. Can anybody draw a picture of what I would look like from my bones? No. Not at all. Not at all. It's an artist's reconstruction. National Geographic admits it. They've had 4 top artists, came up with 4 different views. None of them look alike. One of them is drastically different. Think about that. And think about Ron Irwin, who was drawing a picture of Lucy for a biology textbook from an evolutionary perspective, was told to change it because it didn't look enough like the preconceived notion that anthropologists have that early man must look like. Think about that. So when you pick up a National Geographic, or you pick up a Scientific American, or you pick up a New Scientist magazine, or Science magazine, or Nature magazine, or a textbook in the school system, remember, when you see a depiction of ancient man, it is not a photograph. It is an artist's reconstruction. And he's reconstructing it using his own prejudices, and it has to pass the approval of a board of anthropologists, filtering it through their biases. You're not getting a picture, you're getting an opinion. Thank you. He painted 3 houses for his summer job. Isn't there a song that says something like "Walk like an Egyptian" or something like that? Is there? Yeah. So I'm not familiar with modern music. Thank you. I hear this. Well, paint like an Egyptian. This is amazing. Now, you have to be able to read between the lines, I think. are exposed to things, as you notice things, as you observe things. And all of us observe things, unless we walk through life with our eyes closed, our ears shut, and our mind closed. We don't. But normally we observe things, right? You hear, feel, touch, taste. Well, New Scientist, and New Scientist magazine is available at UNE. The UNE library has New Scientist magazine. New Scientist has an article, this goes back to January of the year 2000, back in a few months ago, about Egyptian paint. There is it's really marvelous, in fact. This is the bright blue. I'm going to get this right now. The wall paintings and the mass on the coffins of mummies is so bright that it looks as if it were painted today, and it's been a puzzle to scientists. How could the Egyptians come up with a paint, concoct a paint over 4,000 years ago that is that bright now? See, the reason there, why is New Scientist amazed by that? Why? Because there's a presupposition that we're smart and they were dumb. There's a presupposition that monkeys fell out of a tree, started crawling around the ground, and evolved into us, and we are the final phase of evolution. We're the peak, we're the top. That's humorous, isn't it? We should really think about that. Well, as it turns out, the ancient Egyptians weren't that stupid. So when you read a scientific magazine that says, wow, isn't this amazing that they were able to do this? You say to yourself, no, not really. Because God created man fully developed. And in fact, I honestly believe that we are dumber. We have more information, but I don't think we're any smarter. Well, here's what they did. There's a blue pigment that they developed, and it took a long time, in fact, for us to be able to even duplicate it. And this is what you can read about in the New Scientist magazine article, how they duplicated it. But it seems that they had to do a very marvelous thing. They had to heat blue crystals of calcium copper silicate to 1,000 degrees centigrade. Now, for those of you that are like myself, 1,000 degrees centigrade doesn't mean much, but you multiply that by 1.8 and add 32, and that's 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit. Do you know how to make a fire that'll create 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit of heat? I don't. A regular burning wood fire doesn't do that. That's extremely hot. And they had to do that in a very controlled environment so that there wasn't excess oxidation going on in the silicate crystals. How did they do that? Nobody knows. It took us a long time to duplicate it, to figure out how they did what they did. They managed to heat in a controlled environment almost 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1,000 degrees centigrade for all of you that come from any place except Maine, who is still using, I think America still uses Fahrenheit pretty much. I worked for the Navy for years, and they tried to force us to go to the other system, and we resisted. And when I retired 3 years ago, we were still resisting very successfully. Amazing. But what's amazing about it? What's amazing to the scientists that wrote the article in New Scientist is that they could do something so technically advanced. So when you read something like that, ask yourself, wait a minute, why? Why are we always puzzled by how advanced people were in the past? It's because you've already assumed that they were dumb, and you're not. Don't make that assumption. It would not amaze me if we found out that the Egyptians had a motorized skateboard. You know? I think that's a marvelous invention. I've seen. This blows me away. There was a kid at Thornton Academy. He came up to I was watching a football game. He's got this skateboard, and it's got a weed whacker motor in the back of it. That's absolutely mind-boggling. I bet the Egyptians had something pretty close to that. Don't be amazed at the advances of the past. Keep this in mind. And remember, when you read things like this, what's really going on. The world around you has already assumed you are the absolute top in evolution. And you started as a bacterium, right? My little example of the rock becoming Frida the frog, becoming a princess. That's the evolution picture, which means that ancient people were not as smart as you. The picture from God is quite different. Adam was extremely intelligent. He was created by God in the image of God, as you are. And Adam did not have to go through thousands and thousands and thousands of years of mutation like we have. Our mistakes are multiplying on and on and on. We're not smarter. Understand what's going on. And be grateful that God loves you so much that even if you are getting a little dumber than your ancestors, it doesn't matter. God loves you. And we'll be talking about that a lot this morning too. Thank you. Muscle Magic is the title of the creation moment this morning. Muscles are an amazing thing, and I don't mean these kind of muscles. These aren't too amazing at all. But muscles are able to attach themselves underwater to rocks, pylons, and ship hulls. A variety of things, even water that's in motion. Now, scientists have figured out how to weld underwater. We can weld underwater. I was involved somewhat with that myself when I worked for the Navy. Scientists have not figured out yet how to glue underwater. A super glue that can be applied in seawater. We can't do yet. No one in the Navy knows how to do that yet, to apply glue underwater. Well, you know what? The mussels figured that out. It's a chemical compound, and I didn't do well in organic chemistry. I had to take organic chemistry, but dihydroxyphenylalanine is the name of, it's a protein-type substance. It's the name of the glue that mussels generate. A single thread of this substance will allow a mussel to actually hold on to a pylon, a rock, in moving seawater, or a ship hull if it's not moving too fast. And then once it applies the first strand, it keeps throwing additional strands out, so that even hurricane forces in water cannot make all of the mussels rip off of the rock and whatever. So scientists are now looking at the mighty mussel, at the muscle magic. They figure, well, if mussels can figure out how to do that, then if we look at what they're doing, then maybe we can do it. Do you see what's going on here? Mussels were designed by a creator with supreme intelligence. And although scientists have been bombarded from the beginning in their scientific education that everything evolved by chance, and there's no such thing as a God, and there's no such thing as a creation, everything is just the chance happenstance, the collisions of billions of subatomic particles over billions of years caused all this to happen without design. Deep in the gut, scientists know better. They know better. The only way to make a superglue that will glue underwater is to copy what the supreme scientist has done. And that's what they're doing. What they're doing is they are examining in great detail right now this dihydroxyphenylalanine that's secreted by the mussel. It takes about 1 minute, 60 seconds to harden into an incredibly strong thread, as it says here. In addition to its long-lasting strength in seawater, the mussel glue would offer other advantages over other adhesives. Doesn't need high temperature to bond. It's not poisonous. What an incredible accident, huh? Isn't that just mind-boggling that by sheer accident a mussel could figure out how to do all of this and at the same time not generate a poison? No heat's required, it's not poisonous, and it doesn't have to have a dry surface. We cannot do that yet. Once again, scientists are looking to the creation of God, to the incredible handiwork of God. God knows how to make a superglue that will glue underwater. God knows how to apply a superglue in moving seawater, and he knows how to do it without poisoning the creatures around it. We don't. We tend to forget that modern science, as we know it today, is the result of Christians who believed in creation. The scientists of 2,000 years ago did not believe in creation. They thought there was no sense to even study the world because it wasn't structured, it wasn't ordered, it was an accident. Evolution is not a new idea, by the way. Not a new idea at all. Charles Darwin just happened to be a tool of Satan that Satan used to make a major impact on the world just a couple hundred years ago, less than a couple hundred years ago. But it was scientists that believed, wait a minute, the world does appear to be structured. We can come up with laws like gravity. Every time you jump off something, you fall down. Because the world is structured, because it is ordered, it must have been created, and therefore we can actually develop an official science. We can study it because it has structure. Well, here's another example right here. Modern science was given birth by scientists who believed that we were constructed by a supreme intelligence. We're still doing it. So think about that. The next time you go down to the beach and you look at a mussel attached to a rock, I know she likes to eat mussels, and so does my wife. I don't like mussels. But when you see it attached to a rock, remember what a marvelous thing that is. Stop to think as you look at the world around you, what an incredible world that God has created. You know, I'll be honest with you. I lived at the beach. I used to go down on the rocks all the time to go fishing. I never once thought that, isn't that magic, that the mussel could attach itself to a rock like that. But think about what an incredible feat that is. This mussel does that in moving seawater. In moving seawater. Think about that. What a marvelous God we serve. What an incredible Creator and Savior God we serve. Thank you. Outer space can be a handy scapegoat. There's some, you know, it startles me sometimes when people sit on the other side of the church from where they are. I do a double take. Lost my whole train of thought. There's an interesting discovery. They've discovered now some plant spores that are in a layer of rock that indicate that these plant spores will have to be over 500 million years old. Well, now, so what? You say, well, that's a big problem. Now, picture this. You have earned your doctorate. You've earned your PhD by studying and being told that time is the friend of evolution and that plants couldn't possibly go back 500 million years because that doesn't create enough time for them to have evolved from the slime, right, the algae that existed in that first puddle. So that's a problem. So what did they come up with? They come up with the idea that perhaps we were visited from outer space. Not making this up. This is true. That perhaps these life forms were originated in outer space. You see, because even 25 billion years is not enough time for evolution to have occurred. The founder or discoverer, one of the discoverers, I have to be careful how I say this, there are two men that are given credit for mapping the DNA molecule, Dr. Watson and Dr. Crick. Dr. Crick, co-mapper of the DNA molecule, is also the developer of a concept called panspermia, that he looked at the DNA and said, wait a minute, this isn't just a book, it's a library. And there are just one cell. Right? And there are, of course, thousands and thousands of cells. There are millions of DNA molecules in your body. It's huge libraries. He said, a book does not write itself. So he had this brainstorm. It's called panspermia, that the first DNA molecule arrived from outer space. He recognized fully that that didn't solve the problem of creation, of divine creation, but he also recognized it solved the immediate problem of providing an answer to the critics of evolution relative to this earth. There's not enough time. And discoveries like this create an even more frustrating episode, if you will, for these evolutionists that have built their whole theology or their whole philosophy, and well, it really is a theology, on a house of cards. It's a theology because evolution means no God. Right? Think about this. Piltdown Man. Over 500 theses were written on Piltdown Man. 500 PhDs were awarded on Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man is a fake. How would you like it? That means there are 500, as far as I'm concerned, fake PhDs out there. Many of these men, of course, and women have long died and have discovered the error of their teaching. But think about this for a moment. How would you like to have a medical doctor who studied a totally false body? How would you like that? How would you like a surgeon who had never seen a real heart? He had studied a fake heart. Would you really consider him a surgeon? When you go in to have surgery, you certainly expect that he knows what he's doing. Right? So these poor people, I actually feel sorry for them. They've built an entire house of cards on a very flimsy foundation, the foundation of evolution, which requires all this time. And I'll close with this. Did we come from outer space? Is there life in outer space? By the way, now, even New Scientist magazine admits that there are no scientists now that believe. Remember those Mars meteorites that showed up back in 1984? No one believes now that those contain signs of life. Enrico Fermi, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who was not a creationist, a staunch evolutionist, said he did not believe that there was life in outer space. Said 50 years ago, well then, where is everybody? And no one has yet answered that question. A visitor from outer space, is that how DNA started? Is that how plant spores got here, a visitor from outer space? Sort of. They were created by God. They were created not as spores, but as full-blown trees, as full-blown plants by God. So you don't have to fall for this silly notion that time, billions and billions of years of time are required for all this stuff to happen by accident. You know that accidents do not build things, and you know very well when you look at a plant spore laying in a rock that's supposed to be 500 million years old, that first off, that rock's not 500 million years old. That's just somebody's idea, and once he's accepted this idea, now he's got to defend it, right? You know that. You know they're not 500 million years old, because you know they were created by God, by a divine creator, probably no more than 10,000 years ago, depending on your chronology of the scripture. No more than 10,000 years ago. 6 to 10,000 years, probably closer to 6. So you don't have to worry. You don't have to fall for this idea that things came from outer space. Now, is there life in outer space? I can't answer that. The Bible doesn't talk about outer space. The Bible talks about this earth. I would suspect that there is not. Enrico Fermi, who is not even a Christian, does not believe, the great physicist, that there's life in outer space. I suspect not. I don't care. I know there's life here. And I know the life here came from God. The Bible tells us it was created by God, for Him, for His good pleasure. Created by Jesus, for Him. That's what matters. Thank you. Georgia peach. Well, there is an incredible canyon in Georgia. This doesn't, I don't know if this will show real well to everybody, but it's quite good size. It's fairly large. And what's incredible about this canyon is that, well, it took 400 million years to make. No. What's incredible about this canyon, it's called Providence Canyon. It's near the town of Lumpkin in southwest Georgia. I've been all through Georgia. I've never seen this. But then again, I've never been to Lumpkin. Interesting name for a town. But in 1832, there was no canyon there. In 1832, in fact, there was a Methodist, the Providence United Methodist Church was sitting right smack dab in the middle of this canyon, about 600 or 700 feet up. In 1832, there were a couple of little ditches that natives remember having to step over. Think about that. In such a short time, from 1832 to now, this went from being a couple of small ditches that you had to step over. They had to move the church in 1850 to keep it from falling in. It says by 1971, this article was written by somebody from England. It said 448 hectare state park, that's 1,108 acres, have been set aside to make this a state park. It's Providence Canyon State Park. And it's identified as one of the 7 natural wonders of Georgia, often called Georgia's Little Grand Canyon. But it was formed in 150 years. It startles everybody. In fact, it says here in this article that measurements taken between 84 and 94 confirm the canyon is still growing. They are still relocating roads and moving things. It's still getting bigger. But in 150 years, there is this awesome canyon. Gigantic canyon. Is considered one of the natural wonders of Georgia, a huge thing. And it formed in 150 years. Now, why is that amazing? Well, because we automatically are predispositioned to think that it takes millions of years for something like this to happen. And I love the quote here, the closing comment if you will, by the author of this article, who is, by the way, a research biologist who has to use a pen name. Her name is Rebecca Gibson. She teaches at the University of New Zealand, and she uses a pen name when she writes creation articles for fear of losing her job at the university if somebody ever found out that she actually believed in God. Still want to spend $30,000 a year to send your kids to university? It does not take millions of years to form a canyon. It just takes the right conditions. That's the whole point. In the mindset of the world, you have been told so often, so many times, so frequently, that the Grand Canyon took millions and millions and millions of years to form because of the layer of sediments in it, that you actually believe that. People believe that. Well, here's another example that I think God has given us on purpose for a reason to challenge that thinking. It's a marvel. Why is it considered a wonder? Why is it a marvel? Because it formed so quickly. To you and I, it's not a marvel, because we know the Grand Canyon formed quickly. Either a little bit of water over millions of years, as Ken Ham says, or a lot of water over a very short time, just a few years. And we know that it was a lot of water, called the flood, over a very short time, just a few years, that formed the Grand Canyon. God is proactive in the world. This canyon in Georgia is another little piece of proof that shows you that you should really challenge the thought platform, the platform of thinking that you are given in school, that it takes millions of years to form an impressive canyon. It does not. The canyon in Georgia was actually formed in 150 years. God is a wonderful and marvelous God. Don't ever forget that. Thank you. I got a kick out of, I was talking to Therese this morning, and I said, the doctor told me this is an overuse injury, and Therese summed it up real quickly. No, it's old age. I think so. The curious population dynamics. It's interesting. My wife was watching the TravelWise channel, and why they would bring this up on the TravelWise channel, I'm not sure, but they were talking about scientists who thought that, well, there was a population change about, 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, or maybe 70,000 years ago, depending on how you do your dating. It's crazy how the dating is done. But a short time ago, there was a population decrease, a dynamic population decrease. In fact, they describe it as a bottleneck, that there was a huge population. It shrunk down to just a few thousand people, and it's grown since then. Well, that was TravelWise, so that sought me looking a little further. So that's interesting. I'd like to know what they were driving at there. And I found an article on the internet through the Answers in Genesis people. In 1970, and in fact this is an article, was it 1970? In a magazine called Genetical Research, and it was 1972, a group of scientists looking at the DNA, mitochondrial DNA from the lady, from the mother, determined that there was a dynamic population decrease in the immediate past. They were smart enough to say that. You see, because people think that we evolved from a common ancestor, you know, the idea of the African Eve. That's a biologist named Tom Coker received a prize for that. He teaches at UNH, as a matter of fact. And they believe that we evolved from a common Eve even 55,000 to 455,000 years ago. Quite a spread, huh? Quite a spread in dates. But in the distant past, well, these guys said, well, in the immediate past, we must have gone through a population bottleneck. How do they know that? Because they have already assumed a rate of change for the DNA. There is a mutation change rate. And if they look at the part of the DNA that is not involved with between the husband and wife combining, like the mitochondrial DNA, then they can calculate the distance of the population from the past. Well, there's not enough time. It's just not enough time. So they know that it must have gone down to almost zero about a few thousand years ago. Well, another interesting article showed up, done by the University of Oregon Medical School, not Christians, who pointed out that, you know, Noah's flood would answer that. Can you think of an incident a few thousand years ago that caused an incredible population decrease? Sure, Noah's flood. Now this article appeared in Nature magazine. So there are two magazines, Genetical Research in 1972 and also in 1972 Nature magazine. Kind of fascinating to me that we know already as Christians that there was a tremendous population bottleneck. There was a large decrease in the population of the earth. Because if you look at the rate of change in DNA, the part of DNA that's not involved in the male-female combination, it's true. It can't go back 1,000,000 years like they would like to think. The population would be huge. So they know it can't go back that far. Something really big had to happen. In the TravelWise channel, they said it was probably meteorites and all that kind of thing. But you know better than that. A few thousand years ago, there was a very dynamic activity going on. We call it Noah's flood. It matches the genetic historical research, I guess, if you want to say. How would you define that? Geneticists that look into the past. It matches what they come up with. Yes, a few thousand years ago there was a tremendous decrease in population, but it was not down to a couple thousand. It was down, we know exactly how many it was down to. It was down to Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives. That's what it was down to. That's the population bottleneck. And before that, there was a huge population. And it didn't take millions and millions of years. So the Bible has an absolutely perfect answer to the population dynamics that are seen or predicted by genetics researchers. Isn't that fascinating to think about that? All of the work of science going on now with our advanced techniques, the genetic research and the understanding that we're having about DNA, Darwin knew nothing about DNA. There are some scientists that say if he did, we never would have had a theory of evolution because it's nonsense. But knowing what we know about DNA, we're able to look back and say, okay, there had to be a time, just a few thousand years ago, when the entire Earth's population was essentially decimated. We agree. In the book of Genesis, it's called the flood, Noah's flood. The population was decimated for the same reason that it's going to be decimated again shortly, because of the sin in the world. So think about that. Your Bible, once again, is sitting right on top of the latest genetics research. What geneticists are finding out, you already knew without spending millions of dollars and without going to a university to get a PhD. You already knew that a few thousand years ago the population was wiped out by Noah's flood. You already know that we come from the same Eve. Only it's not the Eve that Dr. Coker is thinking about. It's the Eve that God created when he created Adam. Thank you.